They told me if I did not cut down the old oak in my front yard, they were going to start taking money out of my pocket every single day. So I let them. Not because I was scared, not because I agreed, and definitely not because I had suddenly developed a soft spot for little neighborhood dictators with laminated badges, but because I already knew something they did not know, and by the time they figured it out, their whole plan was already hanging by a thread. Now, I live in a place called Cedar Hollow, a quiet little neighborhood outside Bend, Oregon, the kind of place that looks harmless when you first drive through it, with clean sidewalks, polite porch lights, matching stone mailboxes, and lawns so neat they make you feel guilty for owning weeds. But if you stay there long enough, you start to notice the rules are not really about keeping things beautiful. They are about keeping people in line. And that was where the Cedar Hollow Residential Board came in. I knew there was an association when I bought the house. Of course I did. The realtor said it with that bright professional smile people use when they're trying to make bad news sound like a feature. Just a small neighborhood board, she said. Nothing intense. Mostly landscaping standards and community upkeep. And I nodded along because at the time I was not thinking about bylaws or fines or power trips. I was looking at the tree. It stood in the front yard like it had been waiting there for me. A massive Oregon white oak with a trunk thick enough that 2 grown men and a hopeful child still would not have made it all the way around. Branches stretching over the driveway, over the sidewalk, even halfway into the street, casting this wide, cool shade that made the whole corner feel older than the houses around it. The house was nice enough. Nothing fancy. 3 bedrooms, squeaky hallway floor, kitchen cabinets from some era no one is proud of, but that tree made the place feel rooted, like it had a memory bigger than mine. The previous owner, a retired school librarian named Mrs. Benton, told me kids used to leave acorns in coffee cans under it, that wedding photos had been taken beneath it, that during one brutal August back in the 90s, half the street dragged lawn chairs into its shade because everyone's air conditioning had gone out. I laughed when she told me that, but I believed her, because some things just carry history in their bones, even when those bones are bark and roots. For the first few months, nothing happened, or at least nothing obvious happened. Neighbors waved, dogs sniffed my mailbox. One guy named Harris from 3 houses down stopped almost every evening during his walk and said, "That old beast still looks better than most of us," which was the kind of neighborly poetry I could appreciate. Then, in early April, I got my first notice from the board. It was taped to my door in one of those clear plastic sleeves, like I was being served a menu by the world's least fun restaurant, and it said the oak's lower limbs were extending into shared pedestrian space and needed corrective trimming within 30 days. Fine, I thought. Fair enough. Maybe a few branches needed attention. I am not unreasonable, despite what certain people would later imply in very expensive legal documents. I called a tree service, asked about a light trim, and figured that would be the end of it. But 3 days later, before anyone even came out to look, I met Lenora Voss. Lenora was the board president, mid-50s, sharp haircut, sharper voice, always dressed like she was either coming from a courthouse or about to sue a bakery. And she had this way of smiling that made you feel like you had already disappointed her before she asked you for anything. She came up my walkway holding a leather folder against her chest, stopped at the edge of the porch, and looked past me at the tree like it had personally offended her family line. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "that tree needs to be brought into compliance." I said, "Sure." I got the notice. "I'm having someone look at the low branches." She did not blink. "Not the low branches," she said. "The canopy needs to be reduced by at least 18 feet on the street side and 12 feet from the roof line. And the board would prefer full removal if structural risk remains." I remember just staring at her for a second, because she had said it with the same tone someone might use to request beige paint instead of grey. And I said, "You understand that cutting that much off an oak this size is not maintenance, right? That is more like taking a ribcage out of a living thing and hoping it keeps breathing." She gave me this tiny sigh, like I was being emotional at a spreadsheet meeting. "The board has determined the tree is a nuisance," she said. I looked up at the branches, then back at her, and said, "The board determined that how?" "Exactly. By asking another board member if leaves are annoying." Her smile tightened. "You have 30 days. And if I do not butcher it on schedule," I asked, "then daily fines will begin," she said. And she tapped the folder with one red fingernail, not hard, just enough to make the moment feel rehearsed. I wish I could tell you I had some perfect movie line ready, but I did not. I just said, no, and she looked genuinely surprised. Not angry yet, just surprised, like a lamp had talked back. That was the first time I understood what kind of person I was dealing with. Lenora was not used to being told no, especially not on a sidewalk she believed belonged emotionally, spiritually, and maybe legally to her. The first fine came the next week, $400, citing failure to begin compliance work. I paid it, which probably made me look weaker than I was, but sometimes paying is not surrender. Sometimes it is just buying time while the other side gets comfortable enough to make mistakes. The second fine was $800. The third was $1,200 and came with a formal warning that continued refusal could result in legal escalation, forced remediation, and recovery of association costs. That phrase stuck with me, forced remediation, because it sounded so clean, so civilized, so perfectly designed to hide the ugly truth of what they wanted, which was to kill something old because it was inconvenient. Around them, people started noticing. A woman named Nessa, who lived across the street and grew tomatoes in 5-gallon buckets, caught me one evening while I was dragging trash bins back from the curb and asked if Lenora was giving me trouble over the oak. I shrugged and said, apparently my tree has committed crimes. Nessa laughed. But it was the kind of laugh people give when they are nervous, because they know the joke is true. Then Harris came by later that week, slower than usual, hands in his jacket pockets, and stood with me under the branches while the wind moved through them. They wanted this tree gone since before you moved in, he said. I looked at him. Why? He glanced toward Lenora's house, which sat 2 blocks over on the corner with the ridiculous fountain, then lowered his voice like the leaves themselves might report back. There has been talk about expanding the guest lane, adding more curb parking, maybe a little monument sign at the entrance. You know, something that makes the place look more upscale. He nodded toward the trunk. That oak is in the way. That was the moment the whole thing sharpened. It was not about safety. It was not about sidewalks. It was not even about property values. Not really. It was about a plan I had not been told about, a plan that needed my tree smaller, weaker, or gone. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with every notice spread out in front of me, the fines, the warnings, the highlighted rules, and outside the window, the oak threw shadows across the floor like long fingers. I should have been furious, and I was, but underneath that was something colder, statier. My father used to say, never wrestle a pig in mud, you both get dirty, and the pig enjoys it, and Lenora struck me as the kind of pig who owned a monogram towel. So I did not yell. I did not march into a board meeting. I did not start a neighborhood Facebook war, although I will admit, emotionally. I drafted several posts that would have gotten me removed from polite society. Instead, I started making calls. The first tree company told me they would not touch it without a full assessment. The second guy asked for photos, then got quiet. The third gave me the number of a consulting arborist named Caleb Monroe, a former state forestry specialist who, according to the receptionist, had a soft spot for old oaks and a low tolerance for nonsense, which sounded exactly like my kind of professional. I sent him pictures, measurements, copies of the board notices, everything, and about an hour later my phone rang. He did not even say hello properly. He just said, "Do not let anyone cut that tree." I remember standing in the kitchen, one hand on the counter, suddenly very still. I asked, "Is it that bad?" He said, "No. That is the thing. From what I can see, it might be that important." Then he paused, and his voice dropped into something calmer, almost careful. "I'm coming out tomorrow morning. Until then, nobody touches it. Nobody trims it. Nobody drills it. Nobody digs near it." I looked out the window at that old oak, dark against the last orange light of the day, and for the first time since Lenora had walked up my path with her leather folder and her fake little smile, I felt the ground shift under the whole fight. She thought she had me cornered with fines, deadlines, and threats. But what she did not know was that the oldest thing in the neighborhood might also be the most protected thing in the neighborhood. And if that turned out to be true, then Lenora Voss had not been pressuring me into compliance. She had been walking herself straight into a wall. Caleb showed up the next morning in an old green pickup that looked like it had been driven through every forest road in Oregon and then personally insulted by half of them. He was maybe in his early 60s, grey beard, sun-cracked hands. The kind of guy who did not walk fast because he had learned somewhere along the way that trees do not respond to urgency. He stepped out, put on a faded canvas hat, and did not say much at first. He just stood at the edge of my yard and looked up. I watched his face because I wanted some sign, some hint that I was not being ridiculous, that I had not turned a landscaping dispute into some emotional crusade over a tree just because I was mad at a woman with a leather folder. But Caleb did not laugh, and he did not shrug. He walked around the oak slowly, one hand brushing the bark, his eyes moving from the roots to the split of the limbs to the canopy spread above the street, and after a while he said, almost to himself, "Well, hello there." I said, "Is that good or bad?" He gave me a quick look. That is respect. Then he got to work. He measured the trunk, checked the root flare, took soil samples, photographed old scars where branches had healed over decades before I was even born, and every few minutes he would pause and make notes in a little waterproof notebook that looked like it had survived wars. I mostly stayed quiet because there was something strangely sacred about watching him work, like I had accidentally invited a doctor to examine a patient who had been waiting 300 years for someone to take their pulse. After nearly 4 hours, Caleb sat on the low stone wall near my driveway, wiped his glasses on his shirt, and said, "Whoever told you this tree needs 18 feet taken off the street side, it has no idea what they're doing, or they are hoping it does not survive." I felt my jaw tighten, not because I was surprised, but because hearing it out loud made the whole thing uglier. I asked him how old he thought it was. He looked back at the trunk, squinted a little, and said, "I will need the core sample confirmed, but if you forced me to guess right now, I would say somewhere between 280 and 320 years old, maybe older." I just stood there for a second, trying to wrap my head around that number. 300 years. That meant this tree had been standing there before Cedar Hollow existed, before the county roads, before the tidy mailboxes, before Lenora Voss discovered the intoxicating power of issuing violation notices in 12-point font. Caleb must have seen the look on my face because he softened a little and said, "Old trees like this are not just big plants. Ely, they are infrastructure, habitat, history, shade, stormwater control, carbon storage, all the things people put in brochures after they destroy the real thing." Then he told me about the County Heritage Tree Registry. I had found a mention of it online the night before, buried in a municipal code page so dry it could have qualified as kindling, but hearing Caleb explain it made it feel real. Any tree of exceptional age, size, ecological value, or historic significance could be nominated for protected status, and once approved, no one could remove it, heavily prune it, trench near it, pave over its root zone, or alter the surrounding grade without county review. I asked him if my oak qualified. He looked at me like I'd asked if water was damp. "Unless the review board has gone blind," he said. Yes. So that was the start of the quiet part of the fight, the part nobody saw, the part that looked boring from the outside but felt like loading stones into a sling. Caleb wrote a report so detailed it made the board notices look like fortune cookie complaints. He included canopy measurements, estimated age, wildlife observations, soil conditions, structural assessment, photos, maps, put everything can say, and one sentence I read 3 times because it made me feel like someone had finally said the truth plainly. Severe canopy reduction as requested by the Cedar Hollow Residential Board would present a significant risk of long-term decline or mortality to a healthy, mature heritage candidate. In normal human language, their trim would probably kill it. I submitted the nomination packet on a Thursday morning, and I remember the woman at the county office taking the folder from me, weighing it in both hands, and saying, "This is thorough." I said, "I have recently become a fan of paperwork." She smiled like she understood more than I had said. Meanwhile, Lenora kept playing her part. Another fine arrived, then another warning. Then I got an email from the board stating that if the tree was not brought into compliance by the end of the month, the association reserved the right to pursue all remedies available under the Community Standards Agreement. That phrase, "all remedies," had a nice little villain perfume to it. I pictured Lenora typing it with a cup of herbal tea and the emotional warmth of a parking meter, but I still did not respond the way she wanted. I paid what I had to pay, documented everything, saved every envelope, took photos of the tree every week, and waited. The hardest part was not the money, though that hurt. It was the way people began acting like I had brought a storm into a neighborhood that preferred weather reports to reality. Nessa still waved. Harris still stopped by. But others started giving me that tight little half nod people use when they are afraid politeness might be considered taking sides. One Saturday morning, while I was washing my truck, Lenora appeared again, this time with 2 board members behind her, a nervous retired accountant named Phil and a woman named Marcy who always dressed for tennis but, as far as I knew, had never been seen near a racket. Lenora did the talking. "Of course, Ely," she said. "The board is trying to avoid unnecessary escalation." I turned off the hose and said, "Funny, because from here it looks like escalation is your preferred cardio." Phil looked down at his shoes. Marcy pretended to inspect a shrub. Lenora ignored the jab. "The tree is creating liability," she said. I asked, "What liability exactly?" "Sidewalk obstruction, canopy overhang, root pressure, interference with planned community improvements." There it was again. Planned improvements, snicked in like a card from the bottom of the deck. I said, "What improvements?" She smiled, but it was thinner now. "Preliminary enhancements." "That is not an answer." "It is the answer available to you at this time," she said. I laughed once, not loud, just enough to make Phil flinch. "Lenora," I said, "you are standing on my property demanding I damage a tree you have not professionally assessed, for a project you will not explain. Under rules, you are stretching like cheap elastic." Her eyes went flat. "You signed the agreement when you bought here, and you are still subject to county law," I said. That was the first time I saw her expression change. Just a flicker, but it was there. She did not know what I knew, but she knew I knew something. She took a step closer and lowered her voice. "Be careful, Mr. Callahan. People in this neighborhood value cooperation." I looked over her shoulder at Phil and Marcy, then back at her. "Cooperation is when people talk. What you were doing is pressure with stationery." That ended the visit. They walked away with Lenora stiff-backed and silent, and I stood there holding a dripping hose, feeling half proud and half terrified because clever lines feel wonderful until you realize they may be quoted in a lawsuit someday. 2 weeks later, the county sent an inspector, not Caleb, someone from the Heritage Review office, a woman named Dana Ruiz with a clipboard of her own. Though hers seemed less haunted by ego, she spent an hour photographing the tree and checking Caleb's measurements, then asked me how long I had lived there. I told her less than a year. She looked surprised. "Most people do not go to this much trouble for something they just inherited with a house," she said. I looked at the oak, at the high branches shifting against a pale morning sky, and I said, "Maybe that is the problem. People think if something was there before them, it belongs less to them, not more." She nodded, wrote something down, and left. Then came the waiting. That was the stretch that got under my skin. Every day I opened the mailbox expecting either another fine from Lenora or an answer from the county, and every day the tree stood there in this maddening calm, dropping tiny leaves onto the walkway like it had no idea it was the defendant, the evidence, and the star witness all at once. Then, one afternoon in late May, I came home and found a thick envelope from Deschutes County wedged in the mailbox. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, made coffee I did not drink, then opened it with a butter knife because apparently when your hands are shaking you become an old man in a movie. The oak had been approved, officially designated as the Alder Bend Heritage Oak, estimated age 314 years, protected canopy, protected trunk, protected critical root zone, and subject to county oversight for any activity that could affect its health or stability. I read the letter once, then again, then a third time slower, because there are moments in life when relief does not arrive like cheering. It arrives like silence. I walked outside and stood beneath the branches. The evening light was moving through the leaves in little broken pieces, and for a minute I just put my palm against the bark and breathed. I did not call Lenora. I did not send a triumphant email. I did not march around the neighborhood waving the letter like a flag, though I would be lying if I said the thought did not briefly dance through my head wearing tap shoes. I made copies, emailed one to Caleb, saved one in a folder, and filed the original in my desk. Then I waited again, because I had a feeling the letter was not the end of the story. It was the fuse. 3 days later, survey flags appeared along the curb in front of my house. Bright pink and orange little triangles stuck in the ground like someone had decorated the street for a very boring parade. 2 men in work vests showed up with measuring wheels and spray paint, marking lines near the sidewalk, then across the edge of my yard, dangerously close to the oak's roots. I stepped onto the porch and asked if they needed something. One of them, younger guy, polite enough, said they were doing preliminary layout for the Cedar Hollow frontage improvement project. I asked what that meant. He said curb realignment, extra guest parking, drainage work, entry feature, maybe some lighting. Then he looked at the oak and made a face. I said, problem. He said, not my call, sir, but that tree is sitting right where the cleanest cut would go. I almost smiled, because there are few sounds in this world sweeter than hearing someone accidentally confirm the thing you already suspected. Later that day, Nessa came over with a basket of tomatoes like we were in a small-town drama, and she had been assigned the role of messenger. She told me the board had approved the improvement project a month earlier, that Lenora had been bragging about how it would modernize the entrance and increase property values, and that a contractor had already been selected. Then she lowered her voice and said, rumor is they put down a deposit. How much? I asked. She winced. 25,000, non-refundable. I looked out toward the flags, then back at Nessa, and she must have seen my face, because she said, Ely, what did you do? I said, nothing yet, and that was true. All I did was scan the heritage designation, attach Caleb's report, add the survey photos from that morning, and email everything to the county planning desk with one polite sentence asking whether the proposed work had been reviewed for impact to the Alder Bend heritage oak and its protected root zone. No accusations, no fireworks, no threats, just a question. Sometimes a question is enough if the answer's already a landmine. 4 days later, the survey flags were gone. The painted lines faded under a light rain. The contractor trucks never came back, and on Friday evening, while I was trimming roses near the porch, Harris walked up with the slowest grin I had ever seen on another human being. He stopped under the oak, looked at me, and said, you hear? I kept my eyes on the roses. Hear what? County froze the project, he said. Root zone conflict. Full environmental review required before permits move forward, and maybe not even then. I clipped one dead rose stem and dropped it into the bucket. Isn't that right? Harris laughed. Do not do that humble thing, Ali, it does not suit you. Then he leaned closer, enjoying every syllable. Lenora is losing her mind. That was the sentence that should have made me feel good. And for about 5 seconds, it did. Because I would be lying if I said there was no satisfaction in knowing Lenora Voss had finally run headfirst into a rule she could not bend with a stern email. But then Harris said the second part, and that was when the pleasure cooled off. He said the board had already spent real money, not just the deposit, but design fees, permit applications, legal review, contractor scheduling, all of it wrapped into this shiny little neighborhood improvement package Lenora had been selling like she was personally delivering us into a better tax bracket. And now, because the oak had been protected, the county wanted a full impact review, route mapping, mitigation planning, maybe redesign, maybe cancellation. In normal English, the cheap version of the project was dead, and the expensive version might still be illegal. I asked Harris what people were saying. He gave me one of those looks older men give when they are trying to be honest without being cruel. Depends who is talking, he said. Some folks think Lenora should have checked first. Some folks think you waited until the worst possible moment on purpose. I nodded like that did not sting. But it did, because that is the funny thing about standing up for yourself in a neighborhood. People love courage when it happens in movies, but when it happens next door and maybe costs them money, suddenly courage starts looking a lot like inconvenience. 2 days later, every homeowner got a letter from the board. It was classic Lenora, polished, vague, and somehow poisonous without ever naming me. It said the community enhancement project had been delayed due to an individual property matter, that unexpected regulatory complications had created financial exposure, and that continued lack of cooperation from certain residents could affect future assessments. Certain residents. I read that phrase 3 times at my kitchen table and laughed, not because it was funny, but because if I did not laugh, I was going to drive over to her house and staple the heritage certificate to her fountain. By the next week, the temperature on the street had changed. A few people still waved. Nessa brought me tomatoes like she was smuggling kindness across enemy lines, and Harris kept making jokes about the oak needing its own lawyer, but others got quiet. Doors closed a little faster. Conversations on sidewalks ended when I walked up. One guy named Brent, who'd never spoken to me beyond asking if I knew what day recycling went out, stopped his truck beside me and said, "Hope you're happy with yourself." I said, "Brent, I'm rarely happy with myself before coffee, so you may need to be more specific." He did not laugh. He said his assessment might go up because of me. I told him it might go up because the board approved a project around a 300-year-old protected tree without checking the law. He said same difference. And that right there was the heart of it. To some people, the person who refuses to be steamrolled looks exactly like the person who caused the traffic jam. Then Lenora made her big mistake. She sued me. I got served on a Tuesday afternoon while I was pulling weeds under the oak, which felt almost too theatrical. Like the universe had hired a cheap screenwriter. The papers accused me of intentional interference with association development, malicious delay, financial sabotage, and breach of community cooperation duties, which sounded dramatic enough that I had to sit down before I finished reading. I remember the leaves moving above me, soft and calm, while I held this stack of legal anger in my hands and thought, all this because I would not let them mutilate a tree. That night was the first time I really felt the weight of it. Up until then, I had been irritated, angry, even nervous. But a lawsuit changes the texture of a thing. It gives anxiety a mailing address. I sat at the kitchen table with the complaints spread out beside a cold cup of coffee, and for one quiet moment, I wondered if I had miscalculated. Not morally. I knew where I stood there, but practically. Maybe I should have told the county sooner. Maybe I should have told the board sooner. Maybe I should have stood up at a meeting and explained everything before it got this far. Then the wind moved through the oak outside, and the sound of it came through the window, low and steady, like the tree had heard more foolish people than me in its lifetime and was not impressed. So I called an attorney the next morning. Her name was Rachel Kim, and she had the calmest office I had ever seen. No motivational posters, no glass trophy nonsense, just small books, a dying fern, and a receptionist who looked like she could defeat a debt collector with eye contact alone. Rachel read the complaint, flipped through the county designation, Caleb's report, the fine notices, the board emails, the project timeline, and then she leaned back and said, "They are angry, but anger is not a cause of action." I asked her what that meant in normal human language. It means they planned badly and want a judge to make it your fault. That was the first good sentence I had heard in weeks. The hearing was not cinematic in the way people imagine courtrooms are cinematic. Nobody shouted. Nobody slammed a table. Nobody yelled objection while a gallery gasped. It was a small room with bad carpet. A judge who looked tired before anyone spoke, Lenora sitting at the board table in a navy blazer, and me sitting beside Rachel trying not to look like a man whose stomach had moved into his throat. The board's attorney argued that I had deliberately timed the heritage designation to obstruct the project, that I had failed to cooperate in good faith, that my actions created unnecessary financial harm for the community. He said the word community a lot, the way people do when they want to make control sound warm. Then Rachel stood up, and she did not perform. She did not grandstand. She just placed the facts on the table one by one. The oak existed before the association. The county ordinance existed before the project. The board ordered extreme trimming without an independent arborist report. I sought lawful protection through a public process. The county made its own decision. The board continued spending money before confirming whether their plan was legally feasible. Then she said, "My client did not weaponize the law. He followed it, and the law protected something the association failed to account for." The judge asked a few questions, mostly about the timeline and the root zone. Lenora stared straight ahead the entire time, jaw tight, hands folded so hard her knuckles went pale. Finally, the judge looked at the board's attorney and said, "I do not see a legal basis for blaming Mr. Callahan for the consequences of your client's planning decisions." Just like that, quiet as a door closing. The case was dismissed. No fireworks, no music, no dramatic gasp. Just a tired judge, a stamp of reality, and Lenora blinking like someone had unplugged the machine that kept her powerful. Outside the courthouse, she caught up to me near the steps. For once, she did not have a folder. She looked smaller without one. She said, "You knew this would hurt the neighborhood." I said, "No, Lenora. You knew removing that tree helped your project. You decided that mattered more than asking whether you were allowed to do it." She said, "You cost us thousands." I said, "You did that when you confused authority with permission." She looked like she wanted to say more, but there was nothing left that paperwork could do for her, so she walked away. The final bill came later. Between the lost deposit, redesign work, and legal fees, the association had burned through enough money that a special assessment went out to every homeowner. That was when the mood changed again, because money has a way of clearing fog. people stopped asking why I protected the tree and started asking why the board had gambled with their wallets. At the next election, the Nora was voted out by margins so wide it almost felt impolite. A month after that, her house went on the market. I saw her once, loading boxes into a white SUV, and we just nodded at each other. No speech, no apology, no victory lap. Some endings do not need dialogue. They just need a sold sign and an old tree still standing in the background. I still live in that house. The oak is still there, wider than my anger ever was, older than every rule they tried to throw at it, dropping leaves on my lawn every fall like it is doing paperwork of its own. I rake them most of the time. Sometimes I let them sit a day or two longer than necessary, not out of spite exactly, maybe just as a reminder that not everything in a neighborhood needs to be convenient to be worth keeping. But I still think about the question people asked afterward. Was I right to let the board keep spending money while I quietly protected the tree, or should I have warned them sooner, even after they threatened me, fined me, and tried to bully me into cutting it down? Would you have done what I did, or would you have handled it differently to keep the peace? Tell me in the comments, because I really want to know where you draw the line between being a good neighbor and refusing to let bad neighbors run your life.